Thanks for joining us this week, and welcome to Mutuality Matters, a podcast hosted by CBE International, where our mission is to promote the biblical message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and leadership in the home, church, and world. Let's get into this week's episode.
Welcome to Mutuality Matters. I am Tara Korpi, and I am here with my husband, Todd Korpi, and we are your hosts of the headship theology portion of Home, Church, and World, and how this affects you and your church and the world around you. And we're so excited to be here for another episode. And we have a very special guest today. Her name is Heather Matthews, and she has her D.Min from Fuller Seminary.
Or Theological Seminary Alumni Unite.
She is a program manager for the Doctorate of Ministry at Wheaton College Graduate School. She's worked as a pastor, a church planter, a nonprofit leader, and a global worker. And she has just released a new book called Confronting Sexism in the Church: How We Got Here and What We Can Do About It. And it is a fantastic book. And we are so excited. When we got this copy of the book, Todd and I immediately were like, we've got to have Heather on here to talk about the work that she's done and just dig into how she got here and the study and the research that she's put in behind it, and where we can go from here as a church and as women and men who are working hard to make sure that we all are contributing to the kingdom in the way that God has called each of us to. So Heather, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm so happy to be on today.
Yeah, we're so excited. Is there anything, as you are thinking through your book, you're like, man, I am so excited about this, what impact this can make? Is there anything as you're like thinking through that you're like, man, this is going to be, I hope this really challenges people in this area?
I think one of the big things with writing the book is that I chose to use the word sexism, which I don't think we use a lot in church circles, because we don't want to think of this issue that way. We want to think that we're all good people and doing our best, and maybe we have theological differences. But I think a lot of what women do experience in evangelicalism really can be called sexism. And it's been painful for me. It's been painful for so many other women, and it harms us and has had huge impacts on so many women. I hope it sparks a good conversation about sexism in the church and the reality of it, and that it really is an issue that we need to address and make progress on.
Yeah, we're excited that you're here, and we're excited to engage in this conversation with you and dig a little bit deeper. Can you tell us a little bit of the backstory about what brought you to write this book?
Yeah, this has been a pretty long story for me. I felt called into ministry when I was a teenager. And so after I went to college, I immediately went to seminary right after college when I was 22 years old. But I really was young and naive and didn't know a whole lot about gender roles and the issue of women in leadership in the church. Although I did grow up in a Southern Baptist church, I didn't have any female leaders who are role models. So I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into at the time. I just knew that I loved Jesus and I felt called into ministry. But I found myself at a seminary that was not very welcoming to women. And it was a really difficult experience. I cried a lot in seminary, and I really had never encountered this type of opposition before. And it was really my first experience of this overt kind of sexism where men wouldn't look me in the eye, where people were not supportive of the work that I wanted to do or my call into ministry. There wasn't a clear path forward for me into ministry. And so that's really when I first started wrestling with this issue and reading a lot and trying to understand my own theological position. So that's really where it started for me. But then I ended up serving in some churches and other contexts that were supportive of women in leadership. But even in those spaces, there were barriers and issues of sexism and resistance to women in leadership and positions that were closed off to women. And so I eventually found myself doing a doctorate of ministry at Fuller. And this just seemed like a natural thing for me to study because I was so passionate about this issue. So for my dissertation, I actually was looking at the barriers that female pastors encounter in egalitarian spaces, But in this book, I look at it even more broadly of sexism in the church in general. So that's where it was born out of. But it's mostly from my own personal experiences and the stories of other women that I researched as I was doing my dissertation.
Mm.
I love that.
Yeah.
I appreciate there was a particular line in the book that I want to read. You define sexism as a subject, as a topic. You root it in a broader system of patriarchy in which we live, regardless of what your theology is on whether women should be pastors or what sort of pastoral position they can ascend to. I think it's an important distinction that all churches exist in kind of a degree of patriarchy that is just laden within our culture. But you get really personal in your perspective where you say sexist beliefs and practices are ingrained in our subconscious. And we live and act according to these beliefs, even when they are outside of our awareness. I am a sexist. I didn't like the first female preacher I heard as a college student. I judged her as too masculine and untalented. I sometimes think strong women leaders are abrasive. When I needed to borrow a crock pot from a neighbor, I automatically contacted a woman. Sexism is a reality even for people like me who are actively engaging in advocacy for women. I think that is so important, especially for those of us who are actively talking and writing and speaking about the empowerment of women.
Yeah.
Talk about why you feel like making that distinction of kind of owning our own sexism is so significant. And why do we need to confront it, even for those of us who very much want to champion women's equality?
Yeah, you're right. I think this is a huge issue and a huge aspect of sexism that we don't talk about because so often there's this unconscious gender bias that we don't see. It's often hidden to us, hidden to other people, and yet it's there functioning under the surface. And like you said, it's been ingrained in all of us because this is just the culture, the water that we swim in, and so often we don't even notice it. So
Mm.
even for myself and for others, I think a really important first step is noticing these tendencies inside of us. And it's from these tendencies that we act and live and relate to one another. And we often don't even notice the way this is impacting women. I had an interesting conversation just last week with my daughter, who's 18. She's just going off to college, and she is a really strong feminist. And I was telling her a story about one of my colleagues whose name is Dr. Hong, and she just immediately made the assumption that Dr. Hong was a man, and which is not the case. Dr. Hong is one of my female colleagues, and she caught herself right away and was surprised that she had made that mistake. And this is the sort of thing that happens all the time. There's just these assumptions that we automatically go to without even thinking, even when we don't want to. And I think especially in the church where gender roles have been so important, it's even more so for those of us who have grown up in the church or grown up in spaces where gender roles are really emphasized. It's just part of the way that we think,
Yeah.
but we often don't even notice it.
Yeah.
What are some practical ways that you've, in confronting that kind of intersexism, what are some practical ways that you've tried to correct that kind of unconscious bias?
Yeah, I think so much of it is developing self-awareness and being self-reflective. I think that's a huge part of how we have to move forward with this issue. And I think for maybe people who haven't worked on that before, often the first step is being able to listen to women's stories, hear what women's experiences are, and then being self-reflective about that, about have I done this before? Have I made these assumptions before? It is difficult to do that, to examine our motivations and our relationships and what's going on, what's not going well. But I think that self-reflection, self-awareness piece is huge.
Yeah. I feel as a woman that's been in ministry, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have felt the same way. Like sometimes women can be our worst critics of one another and holding each other back because there is this sense of I've earned my place or I've had to suffer, so they should have to suffer too. And we pull each other back rather than, even though we are like the biggest advocates, if you will, of women in ministry or women empowerment or female empowerment, we also can be like the biggest people that hold back women at the same time. And for me, I've found, even being around women, I can mirror, if I'm not careful, how they respond to me. So if I'm in a conversation with a woman who feels threatened by the fact that I'm a female leader, I can mirror that same behavior towards her as well. And vice versa. If there is a person that is a pro advocate, that's we're in this together and we're trudging forward and we're breaking ground together, I can mirror that same thing. And I have to be careful to set the expectation in my mind that I'm breaking the mold and we're going forward no matter how anybody feels about me. We're linking arms and we're going forward together. What has been the thing for you that has helped you in situations when you've encountered other women, or have you even encountered other women that you have felt have wanted to hold you back? And then how have you encountered women that have pushed you forward and have advocated even on your behalf and been a support for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that's a huge issue. Women can be the greatest hindrances as well as the greatest advocates. And I think that's been a big issue as we've tried to work for more equality for women in the church, that sometimes other women can be the biggest barriers to that, because even for women, we are products of our upbringing, and so often women have ideas about gender roles that are very entrenched, and change is really hard for men and women. I think women can be the greatest advocates and great hindrances as well. I think for me, many times I feel like I haven't had that many women around me in the workplace. And so one of the things that I've done is just continue to look for other female role models that I can follow as I'm in ministry myself.
Mm.
So that's one of the biggest things that I've done, is try to build relationships and watch other women so that I can continue to grow in the type of leader that I'm trying to be.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really appreciated was, and this is, I teach eschatology to undergrads, and so like there was a chapter where you're focusing on developing a theology of antisexism, and you actually talk at length about connecting that theology to a theology of our kind of eschatological hope of redemption and restoration.
CBE International presents Women in Scripture and Mission. Joanna was part of Israel's ruling political circle because her husband was Herod's manager. Not only did her wealth and position help support Jesus and his movement, Jesus also intended her to be an apostle, to tell the good news. At Jesus' tomb, the angel of the Lord reminded Joanna and the women with her that Jesus discipled them to understand the meaning of his life, death, and resurrection. Learn more at ministrywomen.org.
And so my question is, how can we as Christians, whether we're in a local church, whether in working for a Christian organization, a nonprofit, an institution, or even in our home, how can we practically live into that hope of new creation? Talk a little bit, if you will, about how we connect our work to empower women, to see men and women lead in equality with that eschatological hope of redemption and restoration.
Yeah, I feel like so often I've heard from pastors, or particularly male pastors, that this issue of women in leadership or gender roles is a secondary issue. It's not very important. It's always downplayed. It's not important for the church. There's more important issues like evangelism or salvation. But I get so frustrated and angry when I hear that, because I think this is an issue of vital importance and is part of who we're called to be as followers of Jesus. And as followers of Jesus, part of what we're to do is to bring healing into our broken world. And a big part of the brokenness in the world is this brokenness that happened between men and women, and sexism that has been prevalent throughout history. So I do see working on this issue of combating sexism, of working for the flourishing of women, as part of what we're called to do as followers of Jesus in the world. And I think I talk about this in the book, but I think there's so many ways that we can do that in our everyday relationships, in our workplaces, in the church, politically, whatever the spheres of influence that we have. Obviously, there's been progress for women in all these places, but there's still so much work that we can do. And it's important work, and part of, I think, who we are as followers of Jesus, to address these issues of injustice, that this is one of them. Obviously, there's many issues of injustice, but this is an important one, and I think worth our attention and advocacy in our different spheres of influence.
Yeah. Isn't that really what we're called to do, is bring heaven down on earth, praying thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And if equality is really what God desires, which we know that is, shouldn't we fight for it?
Mhm.
I love that.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes me think about one of my good friends, or a good friend of ours, actually, Dr. John Phelps. He and I used to talk at length about the redemptive arcs that we see in Scripture. And when we look at even from the Exodus and the giving of the Ten Commandments, and how the Decalogue is ordered in Exodus 20 versus how it's ordered toward the end of the wandering in the wilderness in Deuteronomy, the placement of women in the list of things that we're not to envy shifts. It actually, the women are higher, and many scholars associate that with a little bit of Egypt falling off of the Hebrew children as they were wandering in the wilderness. But then we see the role of women, and how Paul, who often gets a bad rap of being a misogynist himself, actually surrounded himself with very strong women and leaned upon them in ministry. And so we see this kind of arc toward equality that I think is important for us to live into, understanding that if Jesus's death and resurrection and second coming are rooted in this reversal of the curse of Genesis 3, then, and one of the products of that curse is women's subservience to men. And so that eschatological hope is the undoing of that curse. So why would we live into the curse when we follow the one who reverses the curse?
Yeah. So it's a Galatians 3 conversation all over again.
It is, yeah.
Exactly.
It is. This is just some Fuller alumni having a conversation. So one of the other quotes that I really appreciate about that you state is this antidote to sexism, which is rooted in relationship. You actually say sexism cannot flourish when men and women have healthy relationships. And can you unpack that a little bit? How does relational cohesion, relational health mitigate the influence of sexism in our lives?
Yeah, so obviously sexism is more than, it won't be solved just through relationships. There are structural and theological issues to be addressed. But I think relationships is an important starting point, especially in the church and evangelicalism, where for a long time, women have been seen as dangerous and temptations to men. And we've set up all these structures and boundaries and different ministries for men and women to keep men and women apart. But I think in many ways, this has just exacerbated the problem. It's caused more problems with sexism by keeping men and women separate, where we don't know one another or understand each other. We don't serve and work together. So I think a big part of combating sexism is simply being in relationship to one another. And I think we were created to be in relationship with one another, men and women, and that it's possible to have healthy, flourishing, cross-gender friendships. When we are living and working together and sharing in community and friendship, that we actually can know one another, that men can understand women and the struggles of women, and they can hear stories of sexism, and they can learn how to be advocates, and women can have the opportunity to not be stuck in strict gender roles and can live and serve and work alongside men. So I think there's so much healing that can happen just through being in a relationship with each other. And there's research out there that shows that one of the major factors with men changing their mind or becoming more supportive of women in leadership is simply because of serving or working alongside a woman in leadership. It's really experiential and relational where often the change comes. And I think that's true of a lot of parts of our lives, but I think it's true in this instance as well, that so much can be healed just by healthy relationships between men and women, where we can live and relate to one another as God actually meant that for us.
I feel like I'm a product of that. I'm thankful for my youth pastor who saw in me the call of God on my life, recognized like when I came to him and I said, I feel like I'm going to serve the Lord. I feel like I should do this vocationally. And he was like, let's equip you. Let's come work with me. And I'm so thankful that as a man, he took me under his wing and I got to learn from his knowledge. And he didn't shove me in a nursery and say, okay, we'll learn from the head of our nursery worker what it means to serve. He was like, you're going to count offering and you're going to sweep floors and you're going to preach and you're going to write altar material and you're going to pray for people. Like, he empowered me fully as a man, and he was not afraid of my gender. And I think that was a really pivotal thing for me, was recognizing that my gender as a woman is not something to be feared by men, but that we can actually coexist together and have a godly relationship that's a friendship. And it doesn't mean that anything inappropriate would ever happen just because we're a man and a woman in a room. So I think we need to break out of that mindset that we're not adults. Like, we are adults. Like, we can make good decisions if our hearts are tuned towards Christ. Let's keep our eyes focused on him and not on, making rules for the exception, instead of looking at what does the Bible actually really say. And in creation, God created man and woman to coexist together and not to be placed in separate gardens.
Mhm.
I think that's one thing that's easier said than done, because as a man, and I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, which has been ordaining women since all the Theo bros on Twitter's grandfathers were in diapers. Like, it's long tradition of, really, the tradition was built on strong women like Amy Semple McPherson and Agnes Osman and others. But at the same time, there was this undercurrent that I should never take a meeting with just me and a woman who is not my wife. And I need to set up guardrails lest, I don't know, sex just randomly combust. Like that kind of, there's this, we are taught, even in spaces where women are encouraged to become pastors, to follow the call of God on their life, whatever that looks like. Men are often conditioned to see women's bodies, or even the presence of women, as a threat.
Yeah.
And I think that to your point of highlighting, and I think much of this is a human problem. Much of it is an American problem in the sense that we tend to over-sexualize all relationships. I think about, in my work with majority world pastors, they frequently talk about how for Americans, everything is about sex. And unfortunately, that makes its way into our work dynamics as well.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
One of the things that really hits on the focal point of this particular theme in the Mutuality Matters podcast, where we're talking about headship. You talk about this story where this well-meaning professor is talking about how his wife confronted his workaholic tendencies. And the way that you tell it is just brilliant, because it starts out like, man, this guy was just, it's the story of repentance and contrition. And then all the best laid plans. It was very well-meaning, but at the same time, in his explaining of his conviction, talked about how he felt convicted to return to leading his wife and children better. And it was this sense of, I've abdicated my role of that umbrella, that figure of covering my wife and children. You know how that story is laden with underlying sexism, and it reinforces a particular vision for marriage and for specific gender roles within marriage. So, well, I would be interested in hearing from your perspective, Heather, is what does a more excellent way look like? How can a married couple in particular, where we are taught, and regardless of what your position is on women in ministry, we're taught, man is the head of the house and the spiritual leader and all of that kind of stuff, which we have many episodes within this podcast that kind of parse out some of the exegesis on that. But how can we remove sexism within married relationships and family dynamics, and to see a flourishing of leadership and mutuality in the home that without the traditional kind of underpinnings of a male-only headship?
Yeah, I think this is so important. I know for me, I've done so much reading about women in leadership in the church, but there's this equivalent issue of looking at marriage. I know you guys are talking about this all the time, but the whole issue of egalitarian marriage is so important to releasing women to flourish, to be all that God has made them to be. And the idea that men should be the head of the home and the spiritual leader in the home has been the main evangelical belief for a long time. And I think one statistic that I saw said that almost 90% of evangelicals would agree that the man should be the spiritual leader in the home. And yet that model just keeps women and men in strict gender roles and prevents both men and women from being fully who God created them to be. So I think we need to talk about this so much more about what a marriage built on equality and mutual submission looks like. Obviously, there's always give and take in a marriage and seasons and changes that people go through, but marriage in general really should be built on equality where both people can be fully who they're meant to be and still interdependent with one another. And I think this really provides a strong foundation for, especially for women, to be all of who they were created to be in their families, in the home, in the world, in the workplace. When women don't have a supportive spouse, it really is a huge hindrance for their whole life to live into their gifts and talents and abilities that they have. So I think it's such an important part of this conversation that marriage is one of the primary places where these issues can begin to be addressed within the family so that women can flourish.
That's great. So Heather, we're getting ready to round out our time with you today. But before we go, we want to ask you, is there any advice that you would give to our listeners on how to live into mutuality between women and men? They don't have to be married, but just as a general rule, how can we live into mutuality together?
I think that probably most of the people listening to your podcast are pretty attuned to this issue. And I'm so excited that this issue is on the forefront of people's minds. And there's so many great people writing and talking about mutuality. And so I guess just related to my book and the whole issue of sexism, my main goal is just to continue to raise awareness of this, that sexism is a issue, especially in evangelicalism, in our families and our churches, and that there's so much more work that we can continue to do in each of our spheres of influence. So I would just encourage people to continue to pay attention, to notice those places where sexism still exists, and to be voices for change in those settings. So that's my main encouragement.
Love that.
Heather, your book, Confronting Sexism in the Church, is available now out from IVP. Can you maybe give a shout out as to where people can pick up a copy of your book?
Yeah, you can find it at all the normal places, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can find it on the InterVarsity Press website. I would love to have you pick up a copy.
Yes.
And please do. It's a fantastic read. It's a great addition to the ongoing conversation around empowering women and elevating their voices. So we're so grateful that you took, we know that writing a book is a labor of love. Like writing a well-researched book is even more laborious. And so we're grateful that you took the time to do both. And we're so thankful that you've come on the podcast today. And we hope you have just a wonderful day. And we also want to wish all of you who are listening a very fond farewell, and join us next time on the Mutuality Matters podcast. Until then, I'm Todd Korpi.
And I'm Tara.
We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
Mutuality Matters podcast, along with thousands of CBE's other resources and content, is available for free on CBE's website, which is possible because of donor support. Together, we can spread the message that God calls women and men of all cultures, races, and classes to share authority equally in service and in leadership in the home, church, and world. Give today at cbe.today/donate.